Ladies are hot. They're so very hot. So much stage to
How's it going, everybody? My name is Will from Ghosthack, and today I'm going to show you my top 5 tips for making super heavy and distorted and gnarly basses for Deathstep or just any kind of crazy heavy dubstep genre. This is going to apply to all the various subgenres as well, and I guarantee you that all of these are useful because I use them, basically all of them, all the time. Some you may know, some you may not. So let's find out. Tip number 1 might be a little obvious, and that is distortion. Lots of distortion. Distortion can turn a cool but not so heavy sound into a cool but very heavy sound. But it doesn't always have to be that simple. You can get very creative with your distortions through changing just generally the distortion types, because some will be quite subtle while others are a little heavier. Whoa. And also mixing up different kinds of distortion. So on this just kind of strange bass that I threw together in a few minutes, I can add a little bit of the tube drive just in Serum, and then maybe let me go to some effects and try out some different distortion types. I could just do a general fast distortion, which is going to be pretty similar. Or maybe I can go into this plugin here, Destructor, which has a bunch of different distortion types that I can choose from, and I can find the one that I like the best. Log's usually my go-to, sounds pretty good. Or there's tons of different third-party distortion plugins as well, such as Faturator. That's a very common one. This one's nice and fuzzy. And it has a color knob, which I really like a lot. So different distortion types will give you different tonalities in the distortion, which can completely change the tone of the sound. For some reason, this thing is just not even going quiet. I got kind of weird with these wave shapers. But you can also take advantage of a lot of distortion in another way as well. And this is the next technique that I want to tell you, is pre-distortion EQing. So I have this fast distortion up right here. There we go, that's the right level. It's just crunching up this simple bass, and I'm going to pull up an EQ. Now keep in mind, this EQ is only hearing this. It's hearing the dry, undistorted version. And if I play around with this EQ before it goes into the distortion, I can change the tonality of the distortion. So let me just take one of these nodes and let me mess around. So I can cut certain frequencies to make it sound deeper or a little more hollow, or I can do something fun. Let me turn it down here because it's going to get loud. Or I can use it as a peak. I can now make it kind of squeal or scream. Like, that's kind of cool. I could even go back into the plugin and, you know, automate something like that. And that can also make the bass kind of talk and seem more alive as well as just generally adding more distortion. Because when you add volume in here, it's going to make the sound go through the distortion even harder. So that can really increase how heavy the sound is perceived. Whoa, did you hear that down there? Oh, that is nasty. The third technique I'm going to talk about is going to be layering. And that sounds very general. It's like, yeah, what do you mean? Just stacking layers on top of each other? Well, that's pretty much it. The layers that you add are really up to whatever sound you have in front of you. So this sound seems to be very deep, very crunchy. It seems to have a nice sizzly high end. So what I think is maybe I could layer something screechy on top of it, and like the screechiness will combine with the deepness of this sound, and it should sound pretty good. So let me make something that's a little more maybe metallic and screamy. I'll use 2 saw waves, FM. Oh, that sounds good. It's like got some cool stereo going on. I like it. So you can see that this layer sound that I have is nice and heavy in this particular region. So I'm going to go back into the other sound. There's also a little mixing tip for you. And I'm going to EQ out a little bit of this region to give the other sound room to breathe. That sounds cool. The original, the layer, they work together. Now it's like, there's like meat to it. Like there's more than just one thing happening at once. Like this is a combined effort. You could also add Foley, other sound effects. I like to add little robot laser sounds in the background as well. It doesn't have to be another synth or another bass. You can layer screams. I love layering screams on top of basses too. You could layer the sound of a chainsaw or something like that. Do some Mick Gordon techniques. Seriously, get creative with your layering. Just figure out what the sound you're working with could benefit from. It could benefit from a little screechiness. It could benefit from some higher sizzle or maybe some deeper kind of growling sound. Think about what would complement the sound that you're working with, and then just try out some layers. There's so much fun you can have with that. Although this sound does sound a little strange in mono. Maybe that's not the best, but it's whatever. It's for the tutorial. It sounds really good in stereo. The next thing I'm going to talk about, actually, I can just go right into this one to talk about this one, because I want to talk about FM. FM is a really, really sick way of making your bass, of giving your basses just that extra bite and that extra aggression that you might be missing. As you can see, without this FM or with the very low amount of FM, it's just that deep saw. But when I FM'd it really strongly to another saw wave, it suddenly got very aggressive and it has much more anger to it. And I can show you this with another sound as well. Let me pull up something. Maybe that's a little less screechy. I can show you how you can use it on something deeper as well. For example, if I take just a sine wave, this is a technique I love to use. And I put it nice and deep. Now it's a sub bass, and I will add a new oscillator here, and I'll choose something really complicated. Let me go with thick and thin. Yeah, you can see there's a lot of stuff happening over here. It's very noisy. I will take this down a couple octaves as well, and I'll turn that down so you can't hear it. If you could hear it, that's what you'd hear, but I don't want that right now. I want it turned down. And then I will FM the sine wave from the crazy complicated wavetable. As you can hear, we get a sound that's very similar to the original table, like very similar if I were to just turn up this volume. It's very similar, but with this FM, you now have the ability to like push it further. Like you can get more aggression than you would just from this table. It gets messier, it gets noisier, you can just push it that much further, and it sounds really, really good. Like that's some motion already. You got a good growly sound going on. And that's just with a couple of oscillators. I haven't done any modulation, I haven't added any effects, any of the distortion or layering that we've talked about earlier. You've already got a really solid sound right off the bat. And change up the sine wave, maybe a triangle wave. It gets even more aggressive when you pick kind of harsher wavetables. That one's crispy. So using FM to add this noisy aggression to tables that might not have had much noise or aggression in them to begin with is a really good technique in my opinion when you start out making heavy deathstep basses. But there's another thing I want to talk about, and that is referring to sub bass and what you can add to your sub bass to help out the bass. So right off the bat, we have some sub in these sounds. We don't really want that because there's so much distortion on them. We want to cut out the sub like most genres of dubstep, and we want to add a clean sub under it. There we go. And now I can go ahead and add a sub. You can use whatever you want. I've been using Serum, so I'll keep using Serum here. I just use this analog BD sine wavetable. with a slight bit of attack and release, and I can just copy the MIDI from our other bass. Turn it up. And we have a nice sub bass. Now, first off, you can add a little bit of distortion to this if you want to, maybe a more subtle distortion, a little more controlled. That's more subtle in the background. I don't recommend just ramming this through some crazy distortion like you did with the other basses, because it probably won't sound as clean. But there's something I like to add to my subs, specifically when I'm making really, really heavy genres of bass music. And that is adding a little bit of noise. For this example, I'm going to pull up 3X Oscillator. I could use Serum as well, but Serum's noise is mono by default, whereas the noise in 3X Oscillator is stereo. It's very loud, so I need to kind of control that. I'll pull up an EQ here, and I will make sure that the sub is cut and maybe roll off the really high end. So I just get a nice organic sounding noise. And I'm going to run it through the same channel as the sub. So let me take this noise and go to the sub channel, route to this track only. There we go. And now I will copy the MIDI, and the sub and the noise will play at the same time. Now at this point, this is where you could get fun with a little more distortion and add the noise and the sub together to make it sound more crispy, but generally I don't tend to do that. I like to just keep my sub and my noise organized. So listen to this sound before I add the noise. And now listen to it after I add the noise. It's a lot brighter. It's got that crispiness and that smoother texture in the high end, which you could also control the high end a little bit if you want. If you want to add more distortion on just your noise, you can definitely mess around with that. And adjust the levels to be how strong or however weak you want it. And here's another good thing, is you can layer this noise on top of every bit of sub bass throughout the drop. So it's going to be layered on top of all of the different basses. And this really helps make sure that all of your basses have the same general amount of high end. Like the high end texture for all your basses is going to be generally consistent because there's going to be that noise in the background the whole time that's sticking with the rhythm of the sub. So it's going to accent the low frequency. When the low frequency is going to come in, it's going to accent it with some very high end so it just feels stronger. And it's going to help glue your basses and other sounds that you're using in your drop together just by it being there. So before I applied all these tips, we were working with a sound like this. Not a bad start, but after the application of these tips and tricks, we now have something much, much better. Now, of course, I could still do plenty of work on this, but I hope that you at least hear the dramatic difference that these kind of tips can have on a sound, especially if you work on your sound for more than 5 minutes before the recording. You could come up with some pretty special stuff, and it would be a shame if these techniques were not applied to help it sound as heavy as possible. That's all I'm saying. I'm looking out for you and your basses. So thank you all so much for watching. If you have tips and tricks that were not on this list for making really, really heavy basses and heavy brutal sounds, let me know in the comments below. And if you don't have any, or you want to learn some more, go down and check, because I'm sure some people will be dropping their knowledge too. Also, if you have any requests for future tutorials or video ideas, let me know as well. I really appreciate that, and I will see you in the next video. Happy producing.